suppose, sort of 19th century dilettanteism, kind of pleasure dome. And he was despairing, kind of the loss of engagement with the seriousness of history. Breadcrumbs in terms of charters. We've had a look at legislation. Let's have a look at charters. Firstly, well, you can start at different points, but not a bad place to start is the Spout Manifesto, which is all about churches. It's all about the desecration, as Morrison Webb would have seen it, of medieval churches, and basically the implication is, don't touch them. Do something else if you have to, as the church, but leave these historical things alone. We have Alvar Regal, Viennese, setting up the first system of values in 1903. We have the Athens Charter, 1931, which didn't quite get erased, but sort of got kind of overshadowed by that other Athens Charter that confuses people, the modernist Siam Athens Charter of 1933, or at least that was the meeting, the Siam 4, I think it was, Congress, on board the ship, the Chartres, which sailed through the Mediterranean, ended up at Athens. They had this conference. It was 10 years later that, and specifically Le Corbusier, who wrote it up as the Athens Charter. So there's a good deal of Corb on his own in that. But clearly, in its naming, I'm sure, intended to obliterate the 1931 Charter. But we come back with the Venice Charter, which is all about authenticity, and a faint sense of there's a sort of spiritual longing in there. Some of the language is very emotive. We then have the Borough Charter, and of course you can fill in other ones as well, but this is sort of some of the high points, which introduces the idea of cultural significance, and very specifically social value alongside aesthetic and historical and evidential or archaeological. A renegotiation of what authenticity means with the Nara Declaration, so authenticity version 2, which culminates for us at least in Conservation Principles 2008, 4 classes of values, including crucially the communal bit, which is the equivalent of the social and spiritual in Borough, and a definition of authenticity drawn straight from Nara. So Conservation Principles bringing in sort of a summary of those last 2 and an application to the British situation. I have to say, Borough is really interesting in its cultural context, which is New World, some 19th century stuff, really worth kind of looking after how we do that, alongside producing a system that can also look after Aboriginal heritage. So 2 vastly different classes of heritage, but a single, prompting reflection on what is in common between these. How do we deal with these under a single banner? Through that, you've got a movement from experts making judgments about what matters, through to at least some sort of role for the public. Questionable as to how much of a role within Conservation Principles, but at least some recognition through the communal value bit that the public has something to say in this negotiation. And then within the world of heritage studies, you have a whole different discourse going on. Laura Jane Smith wrote a book in 2006. If heritage is a mentality, a way of knowing and seeing, then all heritage becomes, in a sense, intangible. My task to redefine all heritage as inherently intangible in the first place. So there's the tangibility, intangibility bit. One expression of that is kind of world heritage, sort of identifying medieval cuisine as heritage. I mean, to me, that's nonsense, in the sense that it's too general to be meaningful. But the idea of intangible heritage and the relationship between intangible and tangible very much on the agenda out there. Whether it's on the agenda here, I don't know this constituency well enough, but it jolly well ought to be. I have a deep misgivings about the idea of intangible heritage, because the people ought to be sewn into the stuff anyway. It's the danger of seeing tangible and intangible is that you kind of shift the people off into a separate category and get on with business as usual, just dealing with the stones that we have learned to love. The actual operation of conservation principles is what I would call the significance two-step. And the key question here is, how does stuff matter anyway? You start with analysis. Here is Boris the Bull, already kind of in the butcher's mind divided into cuts. You take Boris the Bull. Second thing, you sort of do the calculus. You do this kind of operation on Boris the Bull. You feed into the calculus these different values: the evidential, the historical, the aesthetic, and the communal. And before you know, out comes significance. That's fine as far as it goes. And if you look at Boris the Bull as, walking meat, then what you've got out is a pretty good representation of walking meat in a packageable form. But if you regard Boris as a sentient being, living and breathing and warm to the touch, then that process has done something simply by the division, the chopping him up. You have done, should we say, some violence to something that was there. At the very least, one would say that what you've got afterwards is different, in some important sense, than what you had before. Let's move on. The 20th century side of things, 20th century villainy. So this is Coventry. Coventry's great as an example, because Coventry's sort of, everybody's written about Coventry, so there's lots about Coventry, and including at the time. And part of the reason that there was so much written at the time is that Coventry was the first regional city to be targeted in a significant way. And the destruction sort of came out of the blue. First raid on November the 14th, 15th, 1941. There was also the specific targeting of this. Coventry was not the specific targeting of heritage, but the specific targeting of heritage didn't lag very far behind. This is somebody from the German propaganda ministry who would go out and bomb every building in Britain, marked with 3 stars in the Baedeker Guide. Cunning plan. He incidentally got slapped down for that, because that was at odds with the self-definition at the time of Hitler, etc. They didn't want to see themselves as destroying culture. They wanted to see themselves as promoting culture. It also has to be said that in some sense, we started it. We bombed Lübeck on Palm Sunday of that year, 1942. And that absolutely outraged the Germans. And it was a sort of, just a kind of pragmatic utilitarian thing. We want something that's going to burn well, and that's easy to spot from the air with water. That was why, and it was all in the lead up to the first 1,000 bomber raid on Cologne. So that's why, and then you get this tit for tat starting. So we get York and Bath and Exeter and Canterbury targeted and so on. We get, moving on, 1961, Euston Arch, kind of famous loss to the conservation community, very important in the Victorian society's self-understanding, that that painful loss, which galvanised them to future victories. 1981, this is Rayner Banham, sort of arch-modernist, and he talked about the traditional forms of architecture as the embalmed corpus of ancestral folly. So he's kind of really on the technological kind of bit, technological, economical, and he describes the Preserve at All Costs Brigade as anti-historians, trying to deny or destroy history, like someone trying to make the good times last by nailing up the hands of the clock. But history is about process. The objects that the process creates are incidental. I don't think anybody in this room would agree with the last part. The objects that the process creates are incidental. They are absolutely pivotal. And yet, so there's lots to dislike there, but there is something about history being as much about process as about product. And if we obsess only about product, we have missed a trick. Remember the William Morris quote about staying the hand at some arbitrary point with respect to restoration? Is it not the case that conservation can be accused of something similar, staying the hand at some arbitrary point. History being about process. An anti-historical attitude. If you were to put a film to that anti-historical attitude, my choice would be Great Expectations. Particularly this version. There's something absolutely fascinating to me about the character of Miss Havisham. The most memorable Dickensian character for me. If you don't know the story, Miss Havisham is an old lady at the time of the story. And she has a protégée, Estella, who does or does not have a sort of romantic entanglement with the main character, Pip. Miss Havisham is an old lady, still in her wedding gown. She was jilted at the altar, and she has stopped time. So, you know, the mice are running in and out of her wedding cake, which is still on the side. She's, you know, so it's a graphic image of grief unprocessed, if you like. This BBC version with Helena Bonham Carter and Ralph Fiennes, great little quote from Estella: "We are who we are, people don't change." Again, there's an interesting overlap between people and old buildings. One conservation attitude, one response to those traumas, 19th and 20th century, is that buildings shouldn't be allowed to change because of so many bad things that have happened to them. But is that really what buildings are like? Is that really what people are like? It's an interesting parallel, and again, similar to Carla's quote at the beginning of the Vox Pop. Lionel Esher, the fourth Viscount Esher, wrote the book A Broken Wave. He was an architect, very active in the mid-20th century, later 20th century, the book's from 1981. He quotes himself from the RIBA conference in 1964, which I think was in Glasgow. We must beware of contempt for old buildings, just because, like old people, they can be frail, muddled and sordid. That contempt can easily become a sort of architectural fascism. Piecemeal renewal, each piece in scale with the place, is not necessarily a wrong answer just because it's an old one. It's an example of some of the discourse within the architectural profession which has fed into where we are now. So, 1964, 1967, we had the Civic Amenities Act paving the way for conservation areas. Then, fast forwarding to the Faro Charter, 2005. You may or may not be so familiar with this one. On the value of cultural heritage for society. From there's a publication 3 years after, Robert Palmer, in his preface to it, heritage is not simply about the past, it is vitally about the present and the future. So that's a call for a balanced approach to heritage that looks as much at the future as the past. A heritage that is disjoined from ongoing life has limited value. Heritage involves continual creation and transformation. Heritage is never merely something to be conserved or protected, but rather to be modified and enhanced. It atrophies in the absence of public involvement and public support. Why heritage processes must move beyond the preoccupations of the experts in government ministries, etc., and include the different publics who inhabit cities. Such a process is social and creative. Okay, commercial break. There is something absolutely fascinating to me about 1943. During much of the war, the Architecture Review, as we don't know, Architecture Review, prime British architecture magazine, very interesting, not time to go into it, about its position, except very briefly. On the back of pretty much every issue for about a period of about 4 years from when the bombing started, you get this advert. It's now proved that if all buildings are reinforced concrete, aerial attack would not be worthwhile. This is the front of a 1943 edition from April. They did Rebuilding Britain, which was a special edition accompanying an exhibition at the RIBA. There was an awful lot of pressure for replanning, even before the war started, and certainly in Coventry. They'd set up an architects department, new Labour government in 1937 in the city, set up an architects department, wanting to re-engineer the city. And rebuilding Britain, so there's a lot of pressure for replanning to address the issues left over from 19th century industrialisation, which were pretty awful, frankly. What's interesting about Rebuilding Britain, the commentary, it starts, before looking at sort of civic buildings and education buildings and residential buildings as classes of building, it starts with heritage. And the comment is made that Yes, so that's the thing. Before replanning can start, it's necessary to decide what must be preserved. Hastings, Hubert de Cronin Hastings, really interesting guy, editor and owner. 3 minutes? Okay. You also have a really interesting exhibition the same month called The Continuity of the English Town, which brings together all sorts of people, including the Georgian group, SPAB, Council of Preservation of Rural England, under Viscount Esher, father of the previous Esher. Interestingly. The only one of the 12 lectures which mentions continuity is by one of the many architects who are talking about it as a continuing slight novelty, inflection, not infraction. Very interesting there. Townscape, a project created by the Architectural Review, very much focused on genius loci, paving the way for conservation areas, really. And absolutely central to that is Pevsner. I'm going to skip on past what one might describe a church to be, to look at that, yes. There are two keys, I think, a key distinction between conservation as a technical question, which lime mix to use, for example, and conservation as a cultural question. And I think conservation is primarily a cultural question. The key issue in that is about tradition and our understanding of tradition. G.K. Chesterton described tradition as only democracy extended through time. So it's intergenerational, looking back and forward. Tradition is like giving birth, not wearing your father's hat, which I rather like. The fusion of horizons, Gadamer, philosopher. And tradition, this is Thomas Sharp, very much connected with the Townscape movement, the Architecture Review, etc., seeking a third way, which does in part seek actual preservation, but of the more important existing structures, but is principally at the maintenance of character. And that's how he defines conservation as opposed to preservation. Final thoughts. This is a great quote, again from 1943, Winston Churchill, in a debate in the House of Parliament about the rebuilding or not of following bomb damage. We shape our buildings, and afterwards, our buildings shape us. Very important. We understand that historic buildings help shape us as communities and us as a civil society. But equally, there needs to be space for new buildings to help shape us within a sort of sense of continuity. Put another way, you've got the classic nursery rhyme, here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors, but where are the people? That's it. Thank you.